First, I would like to bring up Panel 5, Winning the Fight Against Disinformation and Manipulation of Elections, which Barry will be moderating.
Hello, everybody. It's these lights are very bright up here. Before I do introductions, I just want to remind you that there is a happy hour just after Catherine Tai speaks. And I also want to thank the folks from the last panel. That was a pretty great conversation. We have a really terrific panel here. I'm not going to actually do traditional introductions, because you can read it online. You could read it, in the materials that have been handed out. There's packets in the back. I am going to start with Cristina Caffarra. And Cristina often likes to say she doesn't need an introduction, and she doesn't. Most people know who Cristina Caffarra is in this business. But I just do want to say that Cristina Caffarra is one of the bravest people in this fight on either side of the Atlantic, anywhere in the world right now. Because all of you are part of different communities in your life, different societies, groups of people with whom you sort of grew up with or sort of developed careers with. And to go against a society of people because you believe that what they're doing is wrong, a lot of people will choose not to do that. And Cristina has done that. So that's my introduction of Cristina. She is somebody who actually has, sort of done something that's quite brave. And then after that we have Sarah Myers West, who I will go to next, and then immediately after that, sort of Sarah Wiley. But anyway, I want to start. This is going to be somewhat of a conversation where we are supposed to be talking about disinformation and elections. And it's not just prospective. We're going to be somewhat retrospective here, because we just had important elections in Europe. And then we're kind of in between elections, because, as a lot of you know, in France, the last set of elections at the European level have led to elections at the state level in France. So given how tightly this conversation is tied together on both, around the world, but especially between enforcers here in Washington and enforcers in Brussels and enforcers elsewhere in Europe, I just want to go first to Cristina and sort of, parliamentary elections. Some people just, would say, actually not much changed at all in Europe. And then another way to look at it is we've actually just seen the first part of an earthquake.
Thank you, Barry, and I want to start by thanking you indeed for that generous introduction. And really, I need to mention that you personally were very instrumental in the way in which my thinking in Europe evolved over the years and really coming to this side of things. We just had an election which is effectively one of the first in this mega cycle of elections that we're having across the world. And it has triggered, as you say, an election in France in which President Macron essentially is throwing the gauntlet to the French people. He's saying, me or chaos, you choose. So there is a lot riding on that, because the outcome of that election in France will color a lot of what happens in Europe. As you say, ostensibly not much has changed. There has been no major incident during the election. At the same time, it is very, very clear that the landscape of information has changed, and there has been interference in this election, witnessed by the shift to the right in France and in Germany in particular. There is, in Europe, a law that has been passed. There are a number of laws. The particular one that deals with misinformation, disinformation, interference is the Digital Service Act. And that is credited for having some hope of perhaps moderating some of the worst extremes. So, indeed, there has been no major incident, but it isn't to say that interference hasn't been major. There has been evidence which is documented, for example, that platforms like TikTok have been not effective at spotting adverts, for example, or communications that would not be appropriate. There were calls by civil society to introduce break glass kind of measures. They were not adopted. There's been a sort of a sense, well, let's hope that it doesn't get too bad, and ultimately the Commission is learning lessons. So I'd say that in some sense we haven't had major disaster, but it isn't to say that we don't see, and there isn't evidence of actual extensive interference from Russian agents, from Chinese agents into the process. It's still the case.
And sort of looking ahead to the next Commission, based on what we know now, I mean, and as we mentioned, things could change really dramatically at the end of this month with the elections in France. But with the conservatives, with the victory that they've had, the centrist conservatives, my understanding is we're going to see more of the same when it comes to competition policy. Or do you see it somewhat differently?
What troubles me most about the whole discussion around competition enforcement in Europe is that the framing around power is not yet mainstream. We heard the Commissioner this morning talk about democracy and the role of antitrust in democracy. This is a conversation that in the US is reasonably well established. The current enforcers are making really, as we heard Jonathan Cantor, we know about Lena, this is a major driving force. In Europe, this narrative is much less prevalent. It is beginning, the Commissioner said something, some enforcer may say something. Europe remains in the main technocratic and neoliberal when it comes to enforcing antitrust. We pride ourselves for having been the first to introduce laws, and that is commendable. That is not something I want to undermine. Of course, the Parliament, in record time, a great democracy sign, has passed laws. But the discussion around what we can achieve through antitrust and where the emphasis should be, how do we tackle power, is not there. The conversation in Europe has been entirely funneled in the last 4 years into this law, and then some sort of academic blah blah about fairness and contestability. The notion that we are faced with enormous power which cannot be dispersed through this regulation is not one that is embraced. We continue to tell ourselves the tale that if we enforce, we will be able to do something to improve the lot of our citizens and our digital firms. This is not achievable. These rules are about incremental improvements at the margin. You're not going to disperse the market power of Apple because you have a couple of app stores inside iOS. This is simply not going to happen. Commendable as that is, no one wants to hear this conversation. The conversation about how do we tackle really gigantic power is not being had. The level of intellectual discussion is extremely disappointing. And let me make a final point on this. The conversation you have here about the power you face is serious and grave and all the consequences of that. Think about us in Europe. The even worse thing is none of it is ours. None of it. We are basically using levels of the internet stack, none of which we own. Every single one of these infrastructures is not ours. So to make it worse, one wonders what have we been thinking over the last few years? We are essentially, at every level, citizens, businesses, governments, using Microsoft, Amazon, Google infrastructure. None of it is ours. We were talking resilience before, sovereignty before. What if this infrastructure turns hostile on Europe? We are lost. Where is the thinking about how do we, as Europeans, secure a modicum of independence? These companies are going around bribing governments. Here's 10 billion for a data center, Germany. Here's 5 billion for training your civil service. In exchange for, leave us a little bit alone, will you? nothing too painful. So this is the reality, and I think that what we will see, to go back finally to your question, worries me. Because, I mean, I think we will continue to see this attempt to enforce a regulation which is ultimately not capable of dispersing this power. Companies will resist it. Nothing much will change, and we will be sucking our teeth and saying, oh, I don't know, what do we do? That's where I leave it.
That's a good place to leave it. Sarah West, you and AMBICAC, just in the last couple of years, have entirely transformed the conversation around AI. And it's actually, it's because one of the things that you did first, before anyone else really got into this business, and we did a good here at Open Markets report on AI and power last November, but you guys were way ahead of the curve on everybody else. Part of this was you and AMBA went inside FTC for a period of time. From this sort of perspective of looking at the state of our communications infrastructure at this moment when these AI technologies are being sort of introduced, and combining that with the realities of power, how bad is it? And I just you've often talked about how these corporations started off presenting themselves as sort of the curators, the generous, wise, neutral curators of the public square. Is that true, or are we seeing something radically different, and where are we going?
Thank you, Barry. And I want to first really concur with the picture that Christina just painted. I think that what has motivated a lot of the work that AMBA and I have been doing comes out of a recognition that, our enforcement agencies are doing the job. They are up to the task. They are, very assertively enforcing the law that we have on the books. And the economic and political power of these firms has grown so significantly that, some of the penalties that they'll receive amount to like a budget line that they account for every year. And so, it's for that reason that we recognize that, whatever sort of tech policy issue you want to be working on, you need to start first with combating the concentrated power of these firms. And if you don't really wrangle with that, you're not going to be able to get far on these issues that sort of then get pushed out to the edges. So turning to your question, I think, let's take a step back and look at the arc of history with how some of these large tech firms have presented themselves. If you roll back the clock to the early aughts, these firms were using a lot of rhetoric that presented themselves as, a public square, as, there was a Twitter VP that called themselves the free speech wing of the free speech party. It was sort of this very democratic ethos that, aligned with the use of these platforms as core places where speech was happening. That's actually one of the things that really brought me into working in this space, was recognizing that, if you talk about governance of the internet, these companies were becoming governors of the internet. They were becoming the place where, democratic speech was happening. And I think that what has happened over time is a slow and steady recognition that, one, that role has grown, that they have, you can post on whatever platform or whatever, your own website or anywhere. The odds are very likely that anybody who's going to access, your content, if we call it that, is going to access it through one of these platforms. That's how they're going to come across the information that you need in order for a democracy to function. So concentration of access to communications on these platforms, and if these companies are stepping up into these governing roles, they've been very poor stewards. They've really, I think, not acted in the public interest because they're for-profit companies. They have fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. That's not going to guide them in the directions that the public ultimately needs. And I think that this constellation of issues, we're now several years into recognizing this very thorny tangle of problems that we've become enmeshed in. And now I think we're finally moving towards, movement towards the solutions. But again, unless you really confront the business model, the source of their economic power, and really the fundamental democratic problem of how do you, as any single nation state, be able to confront companies that have, revenues that are larger than many nations' GDP. These are really difficult problems, but ones that we need to really urgently be working on.
So I have a quick follow-up question, but I actually have even a quicker follow-up question, which is, anybody who's actually believed that these for-profit corporations with this much governance power was looking out for the public interest was a sucker?
It was always a marketing play, right?
But sorry, I need to jump in. The reason that you call me brave is because I worked for this company for many years, right? So I do understand economic incentives. They are profit companies. So when we in Europe lament that they do not readily comply to regulation, and we say, you're maliciously complying. Say, how dumb is that? They're not maliciously complying. They're doing what they gotta do: protect revenue, protect income, protect for the foreseeable future. Every year you kick that into the longer grass, it is money. So this is the reason why this stuff cannot succeed, because not they are malicious, they're doing something which is absolutely economically rational. And until we understand that, we are just kind of fuffing.
So, and then, which is a great jumping off point to where we are in the States. We have, in the United States, we have Jonathan Cantor, we have Lina Khan, and, frankly, right now, in the United States, this is the greatest period of antitrust enforcement in history. If you remember your 8th grade civics books, reading about the Standard Oil case or what was happening in the 1930s under FDR, this is the greatest moment in history, and these guys are just getting going. But after 40 years of not doing this, there's kind of a pretty big set of problems. So actually, Sarah, Wes, you've been your particular focus is on AI. There's been a number of efforts, conversations here in the United States to sort of develop a regulatory framework. The White House put out an executive order. The Senate, I know that you've very focused on what Senator Schumer, his process. Was that a good, did that process result in anything that's actually really actionable, useful?
Did it result in anything actionable? No.
Useful?
If you turn back the clock to where we started, like when Senator Schumer announced his Insight Forums, there were already, I think, 40 some odd legislative proposals that could have been brought to the floor right then and there. That's not even talking about the many legislative proposals that have been introduced even before that, or the fact that that's only looking at AI, and many of the things that relate to AI have been worked on for decades before. There's been mountains of work ready to go if you were very serious about trying to regulate this industry. And so the notion that we had to, because of this renewed AI hype cycle, just start from the beginning, I think is misleading. Certainly there are things that are unique about the moment that we're in, but I think what we were saying back in April of 2023 is this is a moment for swift action, and there's a very clear set of policy interventions that could have been made ages ago.
So without calling motives into question, we've lost a year at least.
Yeah, we've kind of run down the clock, I think, for this Congress, and I think it's a shame that we weren't able to move more quickly here.
So Sarah Wiley, Sarah, as you guys would see by reading up on her bio, is an expert in ad tech and the advertising business. So I know you've been spending a lot of time in town sort of getting prepared for one of these big cases against Google, which the DOJ is about to begin in September. Bringing us back to the focus of this conversation, AI and disinformation, AI and sort of the disruption of elections. Is there anything that you've seen? How bad is it? Do we have any evidence that's compelling that this is a major problem at this point, or any evidence to the contrary?
Yes, definitely. I guess I would start by bringing it back to the business model. The business model of the internet is advertising. And we have seen at Check My Ads that business model is broken severely. One of the reasons to understand behind how ad tech works on the internet is advertisers do not place ads themselves on the internet. They have a whole host of people that do this for them. Assistant Cantor brought up the middlemen. We also refer to them as middlemen. And these middlemen act not in the best interest of their clients being publishers, their clients being advertisers, their clients being consumers. What we see over and over again is promises that these middlemen make is to put advertising, to monetize content that is legitimate publishers. Oh, we won't put your ad on, kind of things that are horrible, election disinformation, just to bring it back to that, anti-Semitic content, hate, harassment. These middlemen promise advertisers that they will not put their ads on that content, but we see that happening over and over and over again, that they break those promises and they break their own policies. To go back to AI, there was a very interesting article that just came out by 404 Media. If you don't read 404 Media yet, this is a plug for them. They do amazing work, and they're pretty new to the space. They spent $365 to spin up a fake website that essentially scraped all of their content, and were able to hook it up to AdSense, Google AdSense, and they were able to get it SEO optimized, so it was showing up in Google search rankings. Right now, Google does not take into account how content was made, if it was made algorithm or by AI when they're doing their search rankings. They also don't take into account, whether information was scraped or made by AI when monetizing that content either. So we are seeing that this is a huge problem. We are seeing that the ad industry is behind in addressing the technology.
Actually, and this real quick on this, because I saw Jason Kent was here earlier. And we've had conversations for years in this town about why the advertising industry has not been demanding better service. Because it's not just publishers who are being screwed; it's advertisers who are being screwed. And so, is it? This is a leading question, but is it fear or just confusion or just being out to lunch? What?
I think it's a little bit of all of the above. We see that, I will say that I believe that there is a turn that's starting to take place. An example pretty recently is Match.com, as well as Walmart, found their ads being served alongside CCM materials, child sexual abuse material on Meta. And they were rightfully very upset about this, wrote to Zuckerberg, and Zuckerberg did nothing. So they allowed their internal emails to be used in a lawsuit that is happening in New Mexico that is claiming that Meta has basically made this platform available for child trafficking. So I will say that there is starting to be a bit of a turn with advertisers here. That said, I think that a lot of the trade organizations that are involved are sadly captured by Google and some of these tech companies. If you look at any of the large trade organizations or large trade conferences that are happening, Google is the #1 sponsor. So I feel that there is a bit of a fear there.
Christine, I want to bring it back to you for a sec, and actually to help unpack some of this question of where does Europe go? I mean, you were telling me, so Andreas Schwab, some of you will remember that at our AI conference last November 15th, we had Andreas. He was supposed to be here, but he got the COVID, but he got on video, and he sort of videoed in from Brussels. And Andreas is sort of the father, the parent of a lot of Europe's most advanced sort of regulatory, the new laws that have been coming out. And Christina, you were telling me that you were just hanging out with Andreas, and he's kind of come to the conclusion that the law, regulatory laws in and of themselves,
may
not
not be
enough.
sufficient. So I think what is dawning in Europe on people is that, of course, we've got this set of laws, as I say, on the book. The critical issue is implementation, and we haven't done very well so far. Remember, we have GDPR, one of the most powerful privacy laws in history, which is simply not being implemented because implementation, the agencies in Europe that are supposed to implement it are incredibly ineffectual. And, of course, there is the resistance of big tech. We have had enforcement, which has failed in tech. And then now we are pivoting to this regulation in the hope that it somehow, notwithstanding it being based on the same antitrust principle, which exclude ultimately structural relief, because in Europe we will never touch structurally an American company, notwithstanding all this, we are continuing to hope that some of this will stick. As I say, marginal, peripheral. So I think what is going on in Europe now that we have a new commission, of course all the political games are happening today and in the next few weeks in Europe until we have stable commission with nominated commissioners. But the sense is very strongly that Europe now has gone possibly as far as it can in terms of trying to regulate. It is not going to be transformative. Yes, the regulators have got to be more descriptive, more prescriptive, because frankly, as I said earlier, polluters are going to pollute. What do you expect them to do? Regulators have got to regulate. They need to do what they need to be prescriptive. There is a momentum now in Europe which is born out of a realization that is not sort of new, but we are in a particularly difficult spot. As a continent, we are sort of stuck between the US, notwithstanding all your problems, you're doing fine economically, and China. We are not doing well. The economy is weak. We are not in a good place. Productivity is low, growth is limited, digitization is very limited, and innovation is not happening to the extent you'd expect of a continent of 450 million people. All sorts of structural reasons for this. But essentially, now there is a momentum behind, oh my God, what do we do to lift ourselves out of this hole? And so there is a notion that we need to power up, ultimately, industrial policy, industrial strategy, call it as you like. Of course, there are all sorts of pitfalls and perils in there. I'm hoping that the digital component of this will also be awakened. The notion that we need to make public good investment in infrastructure that is ours. And that in some sense does not depend on big tech. Because we are not going to succeed in taming. The power framing is super important. And finally, I mean, to Sarah's point, we have discussions on AI in Europe, and incidentally, the business model of AI is not entirely advertising. It is not relying on advertising for monetization as yet. It is all sorts of other things, but not just advertising. So the discussion is about how do we somehow control bad outcomes once you have the productization. But no amount of competition at the level of final products, more robots, more robots, more robots, is going to actually disperse the power upstream. This is the reality. And that's what we need to absolutely come to terms with.
I want to come back to this issue of digital public infrastructure. But actually, first I want to go to Sarah West. Keeping the focus for a second on Europe, and I know you guys do a lot of work in Europe. The AI Act, sort of Dragos Tudorache last year, sort of, put together a pretty good piece of legislation. Is that sort of, did that kind of fall into the same problem here? Is nice piece of paper, nice bill, but there's no sword behind it?
Yeah, I mean, so hopefully something got passed. That's more than others have been able to do. But I think exactly the proof is in the pudding. It's how does this then get implemented? What are the gaps and loopholes that were introduced in the final text, and what gaps and loopholes will be introduced in the implementation process? So the short answer is great that there is an AI Act that was passed, but where does it then take us in terms of actual meaningful enforcement, and the jury's very much still out there.
Okay. So real quick, we're moving just to, So the Ambassador Tai is here. So moving just towards solutions, because we know what the problems are, but so Sarah Wiley, just starting with you, in 2-3 sentences, what do we need to do now? We clearly have enforcers in the United States who are eager to act, and sometimes they just feel, as we heard earlier with FCC Chair Rosenworcel, they feel like they just don't have the authority. So that you have eager actors without the law behind them. But what do we need here?
I would say 3 main things. There has been a very interesting proposal, it didn't go anywhere, called the America Act. It was introduced by Senator Lee, as well as Klobuchar was behind that. We need to regulate the conflicts of interest in the advertising industry. We can do that with ownership limits. No large, powerful company should be able to own all sides of the ad tech chain, which right now Google is facing that in court, but we need to codify that. The second thing that I would say is advertisers need the right to know where their ad spend is actually ending up. These large companies do not give access, the granular access that advertisers need in order to track their ad spend efficiently or effectively. And they should have the right to know where their ad spend is ending up.
Terrific. And Sarah West, what is it we need now that will allow us to?
So structural interventions, particularly that are going to contest this emerging business model that is leading to very toxic behaviors by companies. So the ownership of infrastructure, of model marketplaces, of the platform ecosystem, which is the only path to, any attempt at profit in the AI marketplace. So structural separation that really gets at the mixed motives that emerge from that kind of structure. In the U.S. context, I'm really concerned that the conversation around public investment, which is focused predominantly on AI, is going to essentially work in ways that are going to prop up the power of this exact same big tech firms. And so I think also as that conversation unfolds, which is a big thrust of the Schumer roadmap, it's a big thrust of this sort of move towards just widespread AI adoption, we need to be asking, why are we using AI in the first place? Is it, in fact, the right fit for the use case? And start sort of rebuilding from the ground up what has become this sort of breezy presumption that AI is equal to innovation or AI is going to lead to greater efficiency when we really do not see evidence at the moment that supports even that these systems work as claimed. So contesting some of those premises as they are actively shaping the policy conversation that we're having in the U.S.
Great. And just bringing two things together, your statement about structural separation is what we need. And actually the America Act, which was sponsored by Senator Lee, a Republican, a Libertarian Republican, but on this issue, he's with us. He understands it. And both Jonathan Kanter and the DOJ, in his case against Google on ad tech, and Senator Lee, it's the same thing, structural separation. So, Christina, last word. Sarah West just said, in the United States, public investment, not necessarily the way to go, especially at least with AI in the Schumer context. But in Europe,
what we need is structural separation that will be led by the United States, not by Europe. In Europe, no one will do it. That said, even if we carve out the bit of ad tech, which is in the middle between demand and supply, and it's a great solution for advertising, it doesn't disperse the power of the others. What do we do about Microsoft? What do we do about the others? So let's not just kind of focus on one case is going to save the world. Even if that case came to an end, and even if we do structural separation, it's not going to actually disperse power of the others who are sitting there and watching. So for me, where I sit in Europe, it is important that we think about ways of disintermediating, ways of investing in structures that are not entirely fully dominated by these giants. I think that's our only path. It may not be a complete solution. It needs to come together with regulation, of course, but that's what it is.
And actually, you and I, when we were talking yesterday, you said India's done it, Brazil has done it, Taiwan has done it.
There are countries out there, and because we are the global north, we never look anywhere else, but there are countries out there who have said, from the outset, we don't want to rely on American infrastructure. So India is over there, and Taiwan is over there, and Brazil and others. So why don't we in Europe, where rich is God, do something about it? That is my position.
Thank you all. And I can have a round of applause for this great...